I did not leave my room for almost 2 days after I saw the two standing down on my street. Let's just say that seeing two people that wanted me dead were staring at me from my street and driveway really kinda made me want to hide in my room. But they didn't do anything, and soon they disappeared and caused me to quickly call Alexandra. After about 2 minutes of her trying to figure out how to use a phone, she finally got a hang of it.
Hello?
She said rather loudly, causing me to take my phone away from my ear.
Alexandra, you don't have to shout. I can hear you just fine.
I chuckled, putting the phone back to my ear. I could tell the gears in her head were turning before she apologized for shouting at me. It was an easy thing to shrug off, especially with what my life had become.
Were you able to talk to King Creel's mother?
She asked me, causing me to check out the window to check if the woman in question would suddenly appear just by the mention of her name.
Oh yeah, I did. She was not happy to meet me, and now I think her corpse is walking around and wanting to kill me.
I said, sitting on my bed with a groan. Tempe climbed up in my lap and soon enough offered a scrap of paper with a heart on it. Gosh, this guy really has changed, since staring angrily at me whenever I was on my phone.
Oh no, I feared this may happen. Were you respectful to her?
Alexandra quickly asked, the sound of books being flipped through.
If by respectful you mean sticking a candle in her face, then yeah, I was most respectful to her.
I answered. The long period of silence told me that she was certainly not amused by my attempt to make a joke out of this situation.
Did you at least tell her goodbye?
She asked, exasperated.
Was I supposed to do that?
I asked, with a raised brow. The sound of her books falling to the floor painted the picture of her face palming. In my defense, I only skimmed that long-ass list of things I was supposed to do for a seance.
This is bad, Travis. Very, very bad.
She groaned, stacking the books back in her lap and sighing hard.
I think you've angered her spirit enough for her to cross back into the mortal realm. That explains why her and Creel were outside of my house the other day.
This time I heard her hand smack her forehead. I'm pretty sure I was causing her to age rapidly just through this conversation.
What else did you screw up?
Her tone was one of worry. Fair enough, at this point I belong in a Looney Tooney episode with how incompetent I was doing all of this.
I met a black guy with a top hat smoking a cigar that told me where Mama Creel was buried.
I said. Once again, all her books fell to the floor. I'm guessing she stood up from the chair she was sitting in.
You what?
She shouted, causing me to pull the phone away.
Did you meet Baron Samedi without even knowing it?
Now I've heard that name before, mostly thanks to you guys in my previous attempt of escaping the half-price voodoo store. He's a voodoo loa, basically a spirit. He's the spirit of the dead, so kinda makes sense I found him in a graveyard.
I guess I did. He blew smoke in my face and showed me where Mama Creel was buried, and then he was gone.
I told Alexandra, who was quickly running around and probably finding a book on loas. I waited for her to finish before I asked her,
Why? Can he help me, or am I going to have an evil voodoo god on my ass as well? He might be able to help you, but you need to do it very carefully and don't screw it up.
She said in a disappointed mother's tone. Agreeing, I pulled a notepad out and started to scribble what she told me.
You need to offer him cigars, rum, coffee, or even simple bread. Then he might decide to help you. Might? What? Do I have to offer him a human sacrifice too?
I asked skeptically, only to be yelled at to take this seriously. Pouting as I wrote down her instructions, I finally got everything written down and hung up on her with the promise that I wouldn't fuck this up. Heading downstairs, I went into my dad's office and opened his cigar box, shoving a couple into my pockets and borrowing his Zippo lighter. Looking around in his liquor cabinet, I was annoyed to find no rum, so I hoped that the cigars were enough. Telling my mom I would be back, she warned me about the fact it was going to rain, but I shrugged it off. That's what hoodies are for, after all. Running off towards the cemetery again, I checked around the alleyways and lampposts to make sure the gruesome duo weren't anywhere near me. Making it to the cemetery, I entered into the same path I cut open last time and went into it, looking around for any sign of the loa.
Baron Samedi? I have an offering for you, if you want them.
I shouted out in the abandoned cemetery. Walking around, I took the chance and went to check on Mama Creel's grave. and swallowed hard when I saw the grave had been emptied of its content.
The hell you want, boy?
The nasally voice suddenly asked me, causing me to look behind myself and nearly stumbled into the empty grave. The top hat wearing black man looked down at me with a raised brow as he looked down at me. Swallowing hard, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the cigars. His tone changed as he gave me a rotting yellow tooth smile as he took one and smelled it, sticking it in his mouth. He chewed off the end and spit it out on the ground. "A light?" I asked him, holding up the Zippo and flickering it to life. He smiled at me and leaned in, taking a few puffs of it to get the cigar going and blowing out a stream of smoke. He nodded with a chuckle and looked down at me.
"Now, what can I do for you?"
He asked me, his tone much more friendly as he took in the scent of the cigar, was much more excited and happy. "I need your help. Can you save me from King Creole and his mother?" I asked in desperation. He looked down at me as he happily puffed away on my dad's cigar. Stroking his chin and chuckling, he looked down at me and tapping some ash on me.
"Sorry, Sonny. I can't do anything. Mama Creole and I go very far back, and I cannot go back on it."
He shrugged. I stared at him in horror. It really seemed like everything wanted to fuck me with a barbed wire bat. "Oh, don't worry. I'm not gonna turn you over to her. I'm far too busy to care what she and her spoiled brat do." He waved it off, holding the cigar in his mouth. "But you also won't help me?" I asked him. He looked at me with a raised brow and chuckling.
"Look, I hate her son more than anything, but he has a deal with me. Keep his rotting corpse alive no matter what. But since you gave me this beautiful cigar, I'll make a deal with you,"
he said with a smile. I would have accepted his offer, no question, except the crack of thunder and strike of lightning showed me that the Baron was a skeleton staring down at me. Wait! I'll give you all this!" I shouted, sticking my hands into my pockets and showing off the cigars. His eyes nearly leaped out of his head when he saw all of them. "I'll give you them if you give me a good deal, no strings attached," I said, handing over the cigars.
"I like you, kid. You're smart,"
he said with a toothy grin, chewing on the cigar he had, already nodding happily.
"All right, kid. I'll give you a hint as how to beat him."
He chuckled happily and blew smoke in my face again.
"Force him in the ground. I'll take care of the rest,"
he said with a smile. I stared at him in confusion, but when he blew smoke in my face, I coughed up a storm. And when I saw that he was gone, I sighed hard in annoyance. I hate riddles. Walking back home, as the rain started and thunder cracked loud, I looked down at the ground as I thought of the riddle. I stepped in puddles as I made it to my neighborhood, and when I got to my house I froze in place, as my front door was open and split in half. Rushing inside, I looked around the house in horror as I looked for any sign of my mother, and I found her, all right. "Travis, my boy!" A familiar voice greeted me. He sat in my dad's chair, smiling with his stitched-up mouth as he took a sip of coffee from a cup, with my mother's head sitting on the table next to him. My legs gave out as I fell to the floor, covering my mouth and shivering. "Your mother makes a beautiful cup of coffee. Shame this was her last one." He giggled, smiling at me and standing up, tossing the cup on the floor and walking over to me. "You fucking monster!" I screamed, standing up and rushing to tackle him, only to be struck in the back of the head and falling next to him. Looking up, I was met by a tan-skinned woman dressed in one of my mother's dresses. Her hair was black and curled, and she looked down at me like she'd stepped on a bug. "Sweetheart, are you sure he's the one you want to keep?" she asked Creole, handing him the item she had hit me with, which turned out to be his cane. He happily took the item and pushed my cheek hard with it as he pushed his weight against me. "Yes, Mama. Since he took Mary away from me, I want him to be her replacement," he said with a smile, replacing his cane with his dress shoe, grinding it into my face and chuckling all the while. "You piece of shit!" I snarled, trying to push him off of me, only for me to get hit on the head again with his cane. That certainly brought back some fun memories. "You'll never get away with this! I swear to God I'll rip you to fucking pieces!" I screamed at him. Both he and his mother were smiling at my pathetic attempts to escape. I knew I had to do something, and the item in my pocket was the only thing I could think of. Reaching into my pocket, I brought the Zippo out and lit it and put it on Creel's suit pants.
You little shit!
He screamed, pulling his foot away and slapping the growing flames on his legs. His mother gasping and trying to help him out from the fire. Pushing myself up and heading towards the stairs, I ran up to my room and slammed the door, huffing hard as I shoved the door against it. I slid down the door as I shivered at the thought of my dead mother. I curled up hard and planted my face into my hands. I wish I could shed a tear for her. My button eyes prevent me, but my body still acts as if it can cry. The sound of them slamming against my door, clawing at it, caused me to stand up and look around the room. I saw Tempe jumping up and down on the desk, pulling my attention over to him. I went over and picked him up, shoving him into my pocket and scribbling down a note from my dad. Hopefully he could read my horrible handwriting. Going to the window, I stepped out of it and crawled across the roof, heading down the drain pipe and running away from my house as fast as I could. I arrived at the house of Alexandra and Olivia and stumbled into Alexandra's arms as I cried into her, barely being able to tell her what had happened. She quickly took me inside and sat me in a chair, running off to get me some towels. Sitting there and crying into my hands, I felt some arms wrap around me. Looking up from my hands, I saw it was Olivia hugging my leg to try to make me feel better. Smiling a bit, I patted her on the head and reached into my pocket, showing off Tempe to her, which caused her to gasp and ask to play with him. As Alexandra arrived with towels, she wrapped me up in them and sat next to me with a hard sigh. She hugged me and assured me I was safe here. She patted me on the back and tried to get me to tell them what had happened. He cut my mother's head off, and his mother isn't a rotting corpse anymore. She's got skin and shit now, I mumbled, pulling the towels wrapped around me tighter. I lit him on fire again and ran off, I said sadly, looking up to her and sighing hard. It doesn't surprise me. She's a master at voodoo and most likely only appears to be human again. She most likely is using a spell to appear human, Alexandra explained, rubbing my shoulders lovingly, trying to keep me from breaking down and crying all over again. Did you get in contact with Baron Samedi? She asked. Yeah, he's got a deal with Mama Creel to keep Charles alive. He only offered to help with a stupid riddle, I said with a sigh, looking up at her when she made a gesture to me what it was. Force him in the ground. I'll take care of the rest, I explained. She looked at me and stroked her own chin in thoughts, looking at me and asking Olivia to get her one of the books on the table, and she nodded, carefully putting Tempe down on the table and grabbing the book. Running over and handing it to her mother, she thanked her daughter and flipped through the book. He is the lower of the dead. My best guess is to put King Creel in a grave. He'll then most likely lead his soul to the underworld, Alexandra thought out loud, looking at me. I gave her a skeptical look. Ah, yes. I lay on the ground and you push him over me into the grave we dug for him, I mumbled to her, getting kicked in the chins from my smart mouth. Rubbing my leg, I sighed and looked at her. Even if we get him in a grave, what's stopping him from coming back? He said he would take care of the rest. I guess we must simply get him in the ground, she said, closing the book and looking at me. Our silence was broken by the window being broken, and my mother's head rolled to my feet. I looked at it and looked over to the window. You left something at home, Travis. Creel's voice rang out, laughing at me. I stood up and walked over to the window and stared in anger at the Voodoo King standing on the sidewalk. He smiled back and waved at me. He can't come in. He wouldn't hurt Olivia. It's the one thing he won't do, she explained, pulling me away from the window and covering my mother's head with a towel. She set me back down and went back to the window, clearing her throat. King Creel, I would appreciate if you leave my property, she said softly, looking at her. He looked at her with a tilt to his head and shrugged, tipping his top hat and walking off down the street. You'll still find a way to get in, I said with a mumble, looking at the lump of a towel on the floor, curling up in the chair and sighing hard. Travis, it's so cold, so cold. A voice came from the towel. I looked at it and reached a trembling hand out to pull the towel away, seeing that my mother stared up at me with a sorrowful expression. It's so dark and cold, she mumbled softly. I stared at her and stood up, walking off to the bathroom and locking myself in there. I spent a long time there, covering my ears and just dry sobbing. The fucking monster killed my mom, and the last thing I said to her was that I loved her. I wish I could have hugged her and taken her with me to keep her safe. It's all my fault.